Good afternoon, everybody. This is David Farrell with another video on music theory. Today's video includes some discussion about two different topics that have to do with chromatic harmony. Alterations to the 5 chord, some of the different versions of the dominant chord that we see in chromatic music, and the common tone fully diminished 7 chord, a new use for the fully diminished 7 chord. We'll take a look at some familiar chords and find them being used in just slightly different ways today. And so we've got some different topics coming together here, all having to do with expanded harmonic vocabulary. Let's see what we've got today. The dominant is in an interesting place when it comes to tonal music. With the tonic, it creates the foundational relationship for tonal music, this motion back and forth between tonic and dominant. It is so critically important to all the tonal music that we study and listen to and perform. And because this function is so vital, many of the times we look at chromatic chords and we examine them, we find that they're predominant chords, right? Our secondary chords often have some sort of predominant function. 5 of 5, for instance, leads us to actual 5. Our Neapolitan chord, our augmented sixth chords, all of these predominant chords, these are the chords that set up our dominant, and we do a lot of interesting chromatic things before the dominant. The dominant itself often is left alone because we don't want to ruin its function. We don't want to sort of muck up that very, very important relationship between 5 and 1. We want to keep that relationship clear. However, doesn't mean there's nothing we can do to the dominant to give it some different shapes and some different colors. So let's take a look at some of the variations we see on the actual dominant chord in tonal music. One altered dominant chord that we can encounter is a dominant that uses a substituted sixth. This chord is as the name describes, right? We are substituting a pitch a sixth above the root of the dominant, and we are substituting that for the fifth of the chord. This is a consonant interval, right? The sixth is a consonant interval, and so we're not changing the overall character of the chord. We're still creating a consonant chord. Note that we still contain the scale degree of the dominant. Scale degree 5 is the root of our chord. And the third of our chord, which is the leading tone, is also still present. We still have these two very important members, scale degree 7, which has that strong desire to resolve up by step to the tonic, and scale degree 5 descending by perfect fifth in the bass, one of the more final and solid sounding progressions we have in root movements. But instead of having the perfect fifth above the bass, we have that major sixth above the bass. Something to note that maybe seems a little bit weird is that this chord contains the pitches of the 3 triad. Okay, if we look at the actual notes here, we'll see that we have the notes of a 3 chord. But the function of the chord is clearly not the function of a 3 chord. It's the function of a dominant. It's that unstable final resolution before the tonic. And so we don't want to analyze this chord when we encounter it as a 3/6 chord. That doesn't really describe what's happening in the music. We have to take a look and see what's happening and decide what is the best way to describe this harmony. And when it's functioning like a dominant, we want to call it a dominant. This chord is quite similar to a dominant chord that is embellished with an escape tone. If we look at the first musical example I've written for you here, it's of a regular 5 triad, and notice that the fifth, the C natural, is embellished with that escape tone, stepping up to a D natural before resolving down to a B flat. Okay, this is a resolution that we could see sometimes with that non-chord tone. The second example takes that non-chord tone and puts it in as a chord tone in a much more prominent place. Again, notice that this looks like a 3 chord, a D minor triad. These are the notes of a D minor triad, but the function of this chord in music is that of a dominant chord, of an F chord. We have the F resolving down by fifth to the bass. We're resolving to that stable tonic. Let's listen to both of these examples so we get a sense for what we'll be hearing with this substituted sixth. That strong root movement at the bass really maintains the sense of this functioning as a dominant chord, despite it looking a little odd. Some more details about this chord. It can be used in the minor mode. In this case, the chord that we have with the substituted sixth becomes an augmented triad. That substituted sixth creates all major thirds in our chord, and so it's a little bit more dissonant here, but it's still usable. Let's take a listen to this really quickly, our first excerpt that shows the same progression, 1, 5 with the substituted sixth, back to 1 in B flat minor. A nice sound. We can use the substituted sixth in a 5-7 chord as well. This doesn't change too much, but we do have to watch out a little bit for our voicings. When we use a substituted sixth with a seventh, we typically voice the chord with the seventh above the sixth. Okay? This helps us avoid a very dissonant interval of a minor ninth. This interval is a pretty spicy one, and one that is probably a little bit too spicy for some of the music that we study. And so when we find this chord, we tend to see it voiced as we can see in our second example, with a major seventh from E flat to D natural, rather than in the second version I've shown here with the D up to E flat. It's a subtle difference, but it is something that we notice, and so when we write this chord or when we look for it, we're going to want to be looking for this particular voicing of the seventh above the substituted sixth. Let's listen to both versions. That version using the major seventh, now with the minor ninth. The difference is subtle, but that second one may have struck you as a little bit more grating, and it did to a lot of common practice musicians, which is why it was not typically used. A final note, our substituted sixth resolves down by leap to the tonic, okay, true to its origin as an escape tone. It typically does not resolve via common tone, typically does not stay there on that scale degree 3 for the tonic. And so the most common resolution, which I've noted in each of these with a line, all those Ds leaping down to the tonic B flat, is the substituted sixth down to the tonic. This is one of our altered dominants then, the dominant with a substituted sixth, a dominant chord in which we simply change the fifth of the chord for a pitch a sixth above the bass. Let's take a look at a different alteration we can make to the dominant. The augmented dominant is another common alteration that we might find. Just like our dominant with a substituted sixth, we leave the root of the chord alone, right? We still have that descending perfect fifth in our bass. We leave the leading tone alone. That leading tone stays the same, still resolves up by step. But we change that fifth around, again, just like we did in the last chord. Here, instead of changing it to a pitch a sixth above, we raise it by a half step, and that changes the quality of our dominant triad from major to augmented. So all that time ago when you learned all your different triads and you learned the augmented triad, well, here's the place where we finally actually get to see it a little bit. It's a chord that isn't used too often, but when we do see it in tonal music, it tends to be used as an altered version of the dominant. This is a dissonant chord, but it's a colorful chord. It has two half-step resolutions. If we look at our second example down here, we see the leading tone resolves up by half step, A to B flat, and that raised fifth of the chord, C sharp, resolves up by half step to D. This chord has its roots in a passing tone as well, in a chromatic passing tone, that C passing through C sharp to D. And so this is where we tend to sort of find the roots of our augmented dominant. We take that idea of a chromatic passing tone and we just get rid of the original consonant pitch and focus on that non-chord tone, making it a chord tone. We can use this chord with a seventh. The third example shows it. The seventh gives us three half-step resolutions, our leading tone, our raised fifth, and our seventh resolving down by step. And so this is a common usage as well. It's, again, a very rich chromatic chord. The resolution in minor is a little bit odd. The resolution in minor is an enharmonic one. That C sharp, it wants to resolve to D flat in the tonic triad, and those are the same sounding pitch even though they look differently. We lose that effect of sort of the chromatic passing tone of moving from the true fifth of the chord to the third of the next chord. And so we don't really find the augmented dominant chord in minor. Instead, we tend to typically see this chord in major. Let's listen to the three examples I've shown you here. The first with the passing tone, the second, the augmented dominant triad, and the third, the augmented triad with a seventh. Each of these provides an interesting color to the dominant while preserving its most important characteristics, the presence of scale degree 5 in the leading tone. We don't mess around with those. Let's talk a little bit more about some other alterations we can make to the dominant. Instead of changing the pitches of the dominant chord, another strategy we might take to change around the dominant or give us some new sounds in that particular harmonic area is to add extended pitches on top of our chord. When we talk about extended chords here, extended tertian chords, we talk about stacking thirds beyond the seventh in our chords. Most common practice music uses triads and seventh chords exclusively, but we can continue stacking thirds to create chords that continue up using ninths, elevenths, and thirteenths. Of course, once you get to the 15th, you are back at the root again, and so that's one extension we don't need to go that far. In common practice music, the extensions are most frequently used on the dominant chord. The most common extended chords we find in common practice music are on 5 chords, though they can in theory be used elsewhere. We can find ninth chords on the tonic or on the 4 chord or in other places as well. Many times these extensions can also be analyzed as non-chord tones, but if they're used frequently and prominently, it sometimes makes sense to analyze them as members of a chord. If we look at some of our examples down here, we can see just the stacking of thirds, right, of our 5-7 chord. F, A, C, E flat, and B flat, our key of the day today. If we add another third, if we add that G, we get our 5-9 chord. We get a chord that uses the ninth. If we keep adding beyond that, we get a chord that uses the 11th, the B flat. And when we find these chords and the pitches are very strongly used structurally, we do want to analyze them as those extensions. Sometimes we can find these in block chords, as I've drawn here. Sometimes we can see them arpeggiated, as you see in example 3, where our soprano voice leaps through all the members of that dominant ninth chord. In these cases, it makes more sense to me to analyze that G as a functional extended tertian member than as any non-chord tone, because it doesn't really fit the definitions of most of our non-chord tones. Again, we're not messing with the dominant or the leading tone, scale degree 5 in the bass, or the leading tone present in the chord. We are just adding some new pitches to create a richer harmonic language here. We can also use different intervals as we stack up. A common extension might be a 5 with the lowered ninth, 5 flat 9, as you can see I've labeled in my analysis here. This combines the pitches of 5-7, F, A, C, E flat, and of 7 fully diminished 7, A, C, E flat, and G flat. Okay, this is a common version of a ninth chord that we might encounter. When we find ninths, whether they're lowered or not lowered, they typically resolve down by step in common practice music, similar to sevenths. Extended tertian chords are used with a lot more frequency in other post-tonal music and in jazz. And in these musical traditions, the resolutions are a little bit less standardized. You can find these extended things resolving in many, many, many different ways. That's a little bit beyond the scope of the video, and so what I'll say is in common practice music, again, they tend to be treated very similarly to sevenths. They tend to resolve down by step. You can see the G flat in my 5 flat 9 chord. I resolved down by step to an F natural, treating it as I do most dissonances with care to resolve in contrary motion to its approach. So let's take a listen to this very short chord progression in B flat major. You'll hear the tonic triad, the dominant and the 7 fully diminished 7, and then the 2 together as a ninth chord, a 5 flat 9, before they resolve to our tonic. Again, we don't change the critical characteristics of our dominant when we alter it. We don't change the root, we don't change the leading tone, but we do add some pitches here to give it a more rich and dissonant sound, making it a more dramatic resolution to the consonant tonic. This is true of all of our altered dominants. And so as we look at chromatic music, we want to be ready to encounter some of these chords that change around the properties of the dominant chord. But again, as we look at them, whether they substitute a different chord for the fifth, as the sub-6 does, whether they change the fifth to make it an augmented triad, or whether we just add some extra notes as we do in these extended chords, we want to always be ready to identify the dominant by its function, providing that contrast to the tonic and its resolution to the tonic as well. Let's finish up today's video by talking briefly about a different kind of chord, which is the common-tone diminished 7 chord. The common-tone diminished 7th chord is a little bit different from the altered dominants we've been talking about. I don't quite think it's big enough for me to make a video about it all by itself, so I'm going to include it in here on the end here. What are we talking about here? The common-tone diminished 7th chord. This is an alternate way that music can use the fully diminished 7th chord. Okay, this is a chord we already know, fully diminished 7, stacked up minor thirds, but we're using it in a different way. How is it different? Well, our typical fully diminished 7th chord functions as a leading tone chord, right? And all the members of that chord move upon their resolution. We can see here a nice mode mixture example of a 7 fully diminished 7 in C major resolving to the tonic triad. And we can see every one of those pitches moves. The B steps up to C, the D steps up to E, the F steps down to E, and the A flat steps down to G. This is a really typical resolution of the chord, nothing surprising here. The common-tone diminished 7th chord is a little bit different. It does not function as a leading tone chord. This is one of the most important things to know. Okay, this is not a chord that wants to resolve necessarily to 1, though it can. This is a chord instead that is sort of a colorful embellishing chord. It does not have a strong harmonic function, and that's important to know. Most of our fully diminished 7th chords, we have a pretty strong idea that they'll be functioning as leading tone chords, or I suppose occasionally as 2 chords in minor. But this chord doesn't really have a strong function. Instead, its function is simply to give us a chromatic embellishment upon another harmony. How do we know a fully diminished 7th chord is a common tone chord? The common tone fully diminished 7 is characterized by a resolution to a chord whose root belongs to the fully diminished 7th chord, and this is the common tone we're talking about. Let's look at our next example here. We have a C major triad, and then we have a D sharp fully diminished 7th chord, D sharp, F sharp, A, and C. If we saw this chord, we would expect it to resolve like a leading tone chord to an E minor triad, but it doesn't. It simply resolves right back to 1. We notice that that C is a common tone between this chord and the next chord. It's the root of the following chord, and it belongs to the fully diminished 7th chord. This fully diminished 7th chord instead simply functions again as an embellishment, as a sort of almost like a neighboring chord or a passing chord, rather than having strong harmonic function. Okay, this is what we mean when we talk about a common tone fully diminished 7th chord. It's an embellishing chord, and the root of the following chord belongs to that common tone chord. Some things to know about this chord. First of all, we should be ready for a variety of spellings. We know that fully diminished 7th chords are symmetrical chords, and so there are many different ways to spell them. If we look at our first example, I've spelled the same chord 3 different ways here. These chords all sound the same, but they look quite different. When we're looking for common tone diminished 7th chords, we should be ready to encounter some different spellings. That's not going to really change our analysis here. Common tone diminished 7th chords also can be identical to secondary leading tone chords. When we look at these chords, we want to make sure we're looking at the harmonic context. Make sure we're considering the resolution of this chord so that our analysis aligns with the chord's function. If we look at the next 2 examples here, we can see they both start with the same chord, an F sharp fully diminished 7th chord, F sharp, A, C, and E flat. But as you can see, I've analyzed it in different ways because it resolves in different ways. In the first example, It resolves to a dominant chord, to a G major chord in first inversion. And so in that case I said, oh, this chord is functioning like a leading tone chord. Every voice is moving. The root of that chord, F sharp, is a secondary leading tone to G. And so I want to label it that way. In the next chord, though, I see that that bass note stays the same. The C stays the same. The root of the resolution is present in the fully diminished seventh chord, and so here I identify the chord as a common tone fully diminished seventh chord. It's not functioning as a leading tone chord. Instead, it's functioning as an embellishing chord, even though the notes are the same. Got to use our theory brains here to make sure we analyze accurately. Here's a short musical example that uses some common tone fully diminished seventh chords and also throws an altered dominant in there. Note that our common tone fully diminished seventh chord has a lot of stepwise voice leading. This is a very characteristic for the sonority. Lots of stepwise resolutions in it. Let's take a listen. The chords are still dissonant. They are still fully diminished seventh chords after all, and so we've got a lot of tritones in there. But the common tone in there gives them a real different feeling than the typical fully diminished seventh chords that function as leading tone chords. This is a chord that we'll encounter with some regularity in music, and so when we look at a fully diminished seventh chord, our gut reaction should be that it's a leading tone chord, but when it doesn't seem to function that way, this is a nice alternative usage for that harmony. Thanks for sticking with me, guys, with another music theory video. This was a little bit of a potpourri video. We talked about a wide range of things we can do to the dominant chord, whether it's substituting pitches, changing pitches, adding pitches, to give us a little bit of variety. And then we briefly talked about a different usage of our fully diminished seventh chord, the common tone fully diminished seventh chord, which changes the function from a dissonant leading tone chord to a kind of weak embellishing chord. Okay? Thank you for watching these videos. Let me know if you have any comments or questions, of course. Otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks a lot.